For CNU, it is a great, much anticipated time to have Richard Florida come and speak to us. New urbanists have read his books, maybe not all of them, maybe not every member of CNU has read all of the books, but The Creative Class and The Great Reset. These are books that have influenced the new urbanism. We have much in common, the love for cities and urbanism and urban place. Richard Florida is an intellectual. He's also somebody who is into popular activities with people. Esquire magazine, I have to read this quote, so I better put my glasses on. Esquire has included him in its annual list of the best and brightest, and Fast Company dubbed him an intellectual rock star. I don't know if you can have those two words together, but I guess you can. He's the author of several bestsellers, and I'm not going to list them all here, I already mentioned them. A senior editor of The Atlantic, and he's influenced them to have a cities blog that is one of the leading sources of information about cities. He is the director of the Martin Prosperity Institute at the University of Toronto's Rotman School of Management. And of course, before that, as most of you know, he was in Pittsburgh at Carnegie Mellon. And I give him credit. Very few people in Pittsburgh now, because he left there and went to Toronto. And I know in these kind of cities like Milwaukee, if you leave, there's a certain kind of comes back at you in a negative way. But I don't live in Pittsburgh. I live in Chicago. I don't live in Milwaukee. I live in Chicago. But Richard really deserves a lot of credit for the change that happened in Pittsburgh, where they redefined the city as a place where you would want to be, as opposed to a place that you wanted to avoid, or a place of the future, a place for people to improve their lives and enrich their lives, instead of a place that just focused on how great it was 75 years before. That's quite an achievement. And I trace that to a series of attitude changes that happened in the post-war period. Cities had a negative image even right away after the war because of 12 years of depression, 4 years of war, and then all of the terrible things that were done to cities with freeways and separate use zoning. And even the friends of cities would speak of cities in a negative way. Pathology was the way to get more money out of Washington. And so it was really hard to find people that would say anything good about cities. Ed Banfield's book, The Unheavenly City, which came out in 1967, was one of the first books that said pathology, calling attention to, sure, don't ignore the problems, talk about problems, but to focus the city's identity on pathology, on crime, on all the devastation, and then feel like somehow you're a friend of the city because you've identified all these terrible things. That was something offensive to Banfield. And later on, there were other people, both conservatives and people on the liberal side of the equation, that started to have a more positive attitude towards cities. A really key mayor, a friend of CNU, Joe Riley, in Charleston, who redefined that city. But Richard Florida did it in a way that was striking with the creative class. All of a sudden, urbanism was a virtue, not an unvarnished virtue, but a virtue, a powerful virtue. And people who are smart and have great prospects in life, all of a sudden wanting to choose. He was saying this was already happening. His comments were, he acted as if it was descriptive, but it was more prescriptive, at least partially. It created a trend. And that's been very important. Now we can all pick at it. There's people like Michael Piatak in Oakland who talks about the importance of the blue-collar functions of cities and the muffler shops and all that, and criticized Richard Florida for the creative class. Well, Richard didn't mean that cities would just be for latte-sipping yuppies. But he was pointing at a positive about the city, that it was a good place to be. And now we're finding more and more that the city is, in all of its complexity. Manufacturing in certain spots is starting to come back. That had been predicted that would be over. That blue-collar thing, I remember Rick Majerus' father, Rick Majerus, the basketball coach, but his father was one of the vice presidents of the United Auto Workers, and he lived in Milwaukee, and he had season tickets to the symphony. And people would ask him, season tickets to the symphony? He said, yeah, UAW members can go to the symphony, and UAW members can appreciate urbanism. And he lived in the city, and he was proud of it, and the head of the AFL-CIO lived in the suburbs, and Ray Majerus would make fun of him for it. So the city is a place for everybody. It's a place that is also for very successful people. And by pointing that out, Richard Florida added value to American cities and set the intellectual, the people that study urban policy, set them on a different path, a path that wasn't just about pathology. So I credit you, Richard, with advancing urbanism in a really fundamental way. And also now that the recession that we've experienced for the last 4 or 5 years, you use that recession to, again, define it and prescribe the way we should look at it, which is, I thought was beautiful, that urbanism is what we'll embrace as we come out of the recession. Now, if you can just get the hard data to back that up completely, we'll be all set. But without the prescription, without the description, people wouldn't even be looking for that. And so it is my pleasure to introduce somebody who's a great friend to cities and urbanism and to everything CNU stands for, Richard Florida.
Thank you, John, for that very, very kind introduction. And thanks to John and to Liz and all the staff and board members, to Ellen of CNU for inviting me here on this just fabulous 20th birthday party. It is really incredible to see what all of you and your efforts together have accomplished. And I want to tell you a little bit about where my ideas come from. And though I've never been able to be with you before, how much what you do has really, really, really shaped my thinking. And I'll talk a little bit more later about my intellectual roots, but I remember I was starting assistant professor at Ohio State, and I got a call to come visit Pittsburgh and Carnegie Mellon, and I always had a love for Pittsburgh and the city of steel. And it was a joint appointment. The joint appointment didn't pan out, by the way. It was a joint appointment between the School of Urban and Public Affairs and the School of Architecture. And in that very meeting, there was a man with a shock of gray hair with what I thought was an English accent, but it was I came to learn it was a South African accent. And his name was David Lewis. And David and I became very, very, very dear friends. And he took a novice person who thought he was an urbanist and an urban economist and urban planner. And when I came, he took me on a tour of Pittsburgh. And he showed me what a real urban fabric was like. And then he was gracious enough to introduce me to 2 of his students, a fellow named Ray Gindros and another fellow named Don Carter. Don has become one of my closest lifelong friends. We still work together. And Don now heads up the lab at Carnegie Mellon. And Don and I are now colleagues again because the University of Toronto and NYU and Carnegie Mellon have a joint center together. And Don and I I remember the first talk I gave in Pittsburgh, and Don was there, on what would become the rise of the creative class. And then I met Andres and Liz, and I gave a talk in Seaside many, many, many years ago. And then right before I wrote Rise of the Creative Class, I came to Milwaukee, and I met John. And he took me for another tour. And, you know, I think getting to know cities through the eyes of urbanists, new urbanists, urban designers, urban planners, architects, people who know the urban fabric, help to shape and really transform the very crude way I used to think about cities. And then, you know, it's 10 years, John. It's 10 years, almost to this day, that Rise of the Creative Class was published. And then at that period, I thought, it's probably the same thing that went through all of your minds 10 years previous. There was so much wrong and incorrect and so much that people talked about city versus suburb and urban that didn't make sense. And I remember one day I just asked my students, when you graduate, where do you want to live? And I got this flood of things that came back at me, and I said, you know, I have to write that up. And so that book, you're very kind to call it prescriptive, but it very much was descriptive. It very much was my attempt on turning 40, having spent 20 years trying to figure out cities, my attempt to kind of tell people what cities were about, and very much shaped by my own reality. You know, 20 years in Pittsburgh, 20 years of fighting a lot of problematic urban policy, a lot of stadium building, a lot of convention center building, a lot of traditional urban renewal, a lot of overlooking urban texture and many times damaging it. We used to say in Pittsburgh sometimes the best neighborhoods were the ones nobody ever thought to touch. And then my experience being a young boy growing up in Newark and its surrounding suburbs. So I just want to say thank you not only for inviting me here, but to thank each and every one of you for doing what you do and helping me and helping all of us. And I think what's interesting now at this 20th anniversary for you, 10th anniversary for me point, isn't it interesting that the world has come to us? I find this amazing. For so long, I thought I was out in the wilderness on these issues, talking about cities and economic growth and the role of arts and culture and the role of urban design, what I call quality of place. I thought I was out in the wilderness, and then something changed to make this all part of the great changes and challenges of our time. You know, walkable urban neighborhoods and cities and communities where transit, there's higher real estate values, and cities are, and not just New York and San Francisco and Chicago and DC and Toronto, but we were just in Detroit filming a series for Atlantic Cities on Detroit Rising, walking around the downtown, talking to placemakers and community builders who are infusing, have always, but now are infusing that city and attracting more people. We're just in Newark with Mayor Booker and seeing what's been accomplished there. It's happening everywhere, and it's so amazing. But I think it makes our role change. And we kind of go from being rebels or revolutionaries or pioneers, that we have to help people. We have to become more of teachers. And we have to become even more humble to help people. And I'll talk about that. Help people who think they've discovered cities, who think they've discovered urbanism and new urbanism, and help them understand that texture and fabric and all the things that you know. And what's so interesting to me, like over the past decade, like when I first wrote Rise of the Creative Class, I remember the first thing people said, oh my God, it's the dot-com bust. All that bullshit, sorry. All that stuff you're talking about, Florida, and these new urbanist people are talking about people moving into cities, that's going to go away. When a dot-com boom is over, they're all going to give up living their coffee shops and these frivolous lives they're trying to do, colonizing cities, and they're going to go back to a real job and live in a suburb. And then, of course, it was, the World Trade Center, the tragic attacks. That was going to make us all grow up. And then, oh my God, the crisis, the economic crisis. We were finally going to give up these frivolous dreams. But of course, as you said, the power of this shift, the power of cities, the power of urbanism has just accumulated and accumulated and accumulated. We're at a point now where it's a topic of discussion among all sorts of people, not just among mayors and economic developers and architects and urban designers, but of traditional, dyed-in-the-wool, standard economists. So it's something that's really important, and I want to tell you a little bit about my journey and tell you how I come to view cities and how I come to view this nexus about creativity in cities and maybe clear up a few things that you might have thought about me or where I stand on issues. You see, what's bringing a focus on urbanism back? What's making people see increasingly how important our cities are? What's encouraging people to move to walkable neighborhoods, as Ellen and her colleagues have written about, to retrofit our suburbs? As Chris Weinberg has noted, the real estate increasing values in walkable urban and near-in suburban communities. That's not epiphenomenal. That's not something that's just happening because there's a lifestyle shift and people prefer urban living. Our economy has gone through one of the greatest economic transformations in all of human history. You know, for most of our time, human beings on Earth, we developed our economies, we built our communities and societies by pumping natural resources out of the ground. We first located near fertile river deltas. We built up trading towns and communities, and then in the Industrial Revolution, we built these large-scale industrial cities. And when economists looked at this, they had a very simple way of arguing what conditions economic growth. 3 factors: land, labor, and capital. Oh, and then it's very interesting when we talk about resets and economic transformations. You know, the first one that happened in the 1870s, it wasn't just a change in government policy or a change in investment. It was a change in the way we lived that powered economic growth. It was the shift from the farm to the then small-scale, compact, urban industrial center. And even in the 1930s, people talk about the Great Depression and the New Deal and the war mobilization effort and the rise of new technologies. It was the rise of suburbanization and the demand that suburbanization and the change in urban and suburban form that it caused that powered our economy. You know, those first economic transformations, the one that Marx wrote about, the shift from an agrarian to an industrial society, the rise of a mass production Fordist order, they came with a lot of cost. They generated a lot of disruption, a lot of tragedy. We had 2 major Great Depressions. We fought 2 major world wars. We saw the rise of communism and fascism throughout Europe. We saw the fragmentation of civil society, mass unrest. The economic transformation we are going through today is bigger than those combined. Because the first time in human history, the nature of what we do to create wealth has changed. It's no longer land, labor, and capital, which are the source of creating wealth and value in society. But you've all lived through this. You've all seen this. Over the past 10 or 20 years, we've seen our economies globalize. We've seen the rise of China and India, Brazil, the BRICS, the emerging economies. We've seen the deindustrialization of great communities like Pittsburgh and Newark, Detroit, where my wife is from, Milwaukee, where you're from. We've seen manufacturing shift offshore, but our communities didn't die because the nature of how we create value and grow our economies changed. And other people have talked about this, you know, and I had to learn about this when I tried to put it all down in Rise of the Creative Class. People called it a shift from a manufacturing to a service economy. You remember that. They called it a shift from an industrial to a post-industrial economy, an information age, a high-tech age, the internet boom. And the great Peter Drucker, one of my true inspirations, in his studies of Detroit and General Motors in the 50s, said what we're shifting to is a knowledge economy. An economy where it's no longer the ability to mass natural resources, oil, coal, petroleum, iron ore, and combine them with the physical labor power, the things that Marx wrote about, the physical labor power of a working class, that in fact the nexus of economic growth was shifting from that to the human mind. And I read Drucker's work very closely, and then one day it dawned on me. And I guess it's because I'm such a lover of classical economists like Adam Smith or social contract theorists like John Locke or Jean Rousseau, since I read so much Marx when I was a kid. And what Marx was trying to get at was not just the evolution of capitalism, but the things that we did as human beings that made us all similar. And he argued that what created not only economic growth, but what bound human beings together as a collective was not our ability to vote or to express ourselves or our freedom. It was our ability to use our physical labor to transform nature. He called it intersubjectively. A big word for when we come together and work in a damn factory in Milwaukee or Chicago or Pittsburgh or the Rhine We become ourselves, we transform nature, we become a class. And I said to myself, what's new and different in this society isn't the information we create, the technologies we build, the services we generate, or the knowledge that's poured into our head. It's not really even our physical labor. What binds together every human being, every one of us in this room, every little boy and girl, every person, regardless of where on earth you were born or when you were born, if you're black or white, Hispanic, African American, Latino, Asian American, no matter what kind of family you grew up in, whether you're gay or straight, no matter able-bodied or disabled, I could go on. What binds us all together is something that's more fundamental and elemental, psychologists will tell us, than our physical labor. It is the thing that we all share. It's our innate human creativity. And that's why I began to define our economy, not as a knowledge economy and an information economy, but as a creative economy. And it's this shift to creativity as the very stuff of economic growth that is the underlying force that is causing us to reshape our urban form, to migrate back to great cities, to rebuild our cities, and reshaping our suburban and exurban environments. Now John said this. Since I wrote that book, I've certainly had my share of critics. You've probably heard some of my critics. By the way, I like my critics. I find that I learn a ton from my critics. I think that my critics make me reflect and introspect and force me to look at the logic of my argument. Some critics were fairly easy for me to dismiss. There's one guy, he calls himself an urbanist. I won't name him. You might guess who he is. You know, he said, has Florida lost his mind in this idea that communities with gay and bohemian arts and culturally innovative people, that they does he really think people with guitars, strumming guitars on street, they're going to build our economy? Other ones said Florida's totally lost his mind. He's undermining the American family and Judeo-Christian civilization as we currently know it. But the critics that really got me, because John knows where I come from, were the ones who said this idea of a creative class and a creative economy are elitist. So I just got to spend a minute on this so you all know where I'm coming from. The core argument of all my work, every single thing I've written for more than 30 years, every single human being is creative. That's the bottom line. Every single human being is creative. And that what's really we have to do is not focus on shifting or manipulating or attracting the 30 or 35% of us in this room and elsewhere who have God's good fortune that we get paid to use our creativity in our job. It's to stoke the creative furnace that lies deep within every single individual. That's our task as city builders and community builders and placemakers, to stoke that creativity that lies deep within everyone, to expand the boundaries of the creative class, to tap that creative furnace. That's the missing element in our society. And I just want to tell you how I learned it. I didn't learn it. I have no background in arts and culture. I didn't study arts and culture. I didn't study arts districts. I didn't study diversity. I came to that all late in my life. I studied factories. If you go back and read my work, I studied factories for nearly 20 years before I came to this turn. I began to see that the factories that were growing versus the ones that were declining, the ones that were reindustrializing their communities, not deindustrializing, did something different. They didn't have a boss and high-powered engineers and MBAs. They empowered the workers on the factory floor. And then when I was writing Rise of the Creative Class, I figured out where I learned this, and I need to tell you this. I learned this from my dad. My dad's name was Louis Florida. He was born in 1921 in Newark, New Jersey, the son of Italian immigrants. My dad left junior high school at age 13 in 1934 at the apex of Depression because he had to get a job. Got a job in a factory, Victory Optical, in the down neck, ironbound section of New York. me. That's what the great mayors like John have said to me. Let's go for a walk and see what a city's really like. And let's use the power of our eyes and you have those skills. So let's show people around the world how important urbanism and new urbanism really can be. Thanks so much for having me. It's just been a pleasure being with you this evening. What up? Yeah, I can take some questions.
All right, okay. Two things. Okay. All right, stop it. Stop it. We're going to take a couple questions. So
you have to moderate the question.
All right, I will. Any immoderate questions will be the ones you get. All right. But before I do that, and I know your wife will appreciate this, Richard will be signing books immediately after this. And I read The Great Reset. It's a great read. So if you haven't bought it, buy it. Okay. One other thing before you take a question. Is Mike Levin in the house? Mike Levin. Is he here? There he is. Stand up. All right. Now, I want you to know. See that guy back there?
Hi, Mike.
Mike Levin. He's the guy that rebuts that guy you didn't mention whose initials are Joel Kotkin.
No, I don't know.
Okay.
I like Joel.
Okay. I know. I like all kinds of people.
Brother, thank you.
Yeah, but there's the guy. He's the anti-Kotkin. Okay. Now, we like Kotkin, actually. We all like him. Rick Cole likes him, the manager of Pasadena. All right, first question. Yeah, come up to this mic right here. Oh, first question. Doug Kelbaugh.
Okay. Thank you for the inspirational talk.
Thank you.
And the thank yous you gave us as well. I'm certainly a complete believer in what you're saying, and most of the people in the room are. We believe in walkable, mixed-use, transit-oriented urbanism, and many of us live it. I happen to live in a downtown. I have, believe it or not, a walk score of 100. It's the Street Smart walk score. And we're able to walk to great places. And we have a very low overhead because of that. We don't use our car very often. We have one car. We can walk or bike to great cultural events, both street and SOBs, as you call them. But you actually have given me some pause, because I've been thinking about creativity during your talk, and I actually think I get many more creative juices going at events like this conference. And where I work, it's not a factory, it's a university building, but actually I don't get as much creativity from biking and walking around my neighborhood as I do from my workplace or from events like this. So you've actually raised some doubts for me.
So I agree with you. And, it's funny, I didn't talk about the health benefits of walkability, or we all know that. But certainly as a creative person, I agree. I get as much or more stimulation from meeting great, interesting people everywhere, especially in focused interaction like this. So it's a balance. One other thing I want to add, if I seemed a little too extreme, which is one puzzle that I'm dealing with. And there are places that depend on the car. And so I'm by no means impugning cars. I actually like cars. I don't drive very much, but I like cars. Well, I'm 54. That makes sense. I've grown up in the age of the car. But places like Silicon Valley, which are terribly car dependent, and Nashville in music are exceptionally innovative. So I don't mean to impugn driving either. And in fact, those places may have a better sense. Jonah Lehrer, when I interviewed him, said they have a kind of city characteristics by default, or they try to emulate certain elements of it. But I think you're right. In our great world, it's not an either or. It's not all compacted. It's certainly the ability to travel and interact and connect over long distances. But when we do that, we also tend to do that in cities.
Hello? Yeah. It's a terrific experience listening to you and reading your work. I'll just put this question in the form of cities, because I'm just curious about your thoughts. You have the Atlantic Cities blog. What about Atlantic City? Camden, New Jersey, Cleveland, much of Detroit, parts of South Side Chicago, East St. Louis. I'm been so inspired. I'm looking for inspiring thoughts on those.
Well, it's sort of our life's mission, isn't it? To the Newarks of the world. You know, I keep thinking about why I was drawn to cities because I saw one dismembered. I saw the factory my dad worked in close. I saw the neighborhood I lived in be destroyed. I saw where my mom worked at the Star Ledger become barbed wired. And I think I've always tried to grasp at how do you remake what I imagine as a young boy of the dynamism of Newark. One of the projects I'm embarking on, hopefully with support from a major foundation, is just this, to try to figure out a typology of cities not only in the United States but globally. You know, the cities that are revitalizing are doing it in a way that is uneven, that is also spiky. So how do we build cities that are good for everyone? And I just want to give you my thought. I think our biggest challenge on this is that if 40 million Americans work in creative jobs, nearly 70 million Americans work in low-wage service jobs. And one of the great challenges of urbanism has to do for those service jobs what happened to my dad's job in manufacturing. We have to make them good family-supporting jobs, and it's something I've been very passionate about. So at the same time that we remake and begin to rebuild those disadvantaged neighborhoods, those neighborhoods left behind, we're going to have to create meaningful work. And it's going to mean taking on the big challenge of putting more creativity and innovation and skill in low-wage jobs. And it's a big agenda.
Okay, we have one over here and one over here, and then then that'll be it.
You mentioned that you like cars, you know, but you don't drive too much. And when you're traveling between places, between cities, can you reflect on like the different modalities of like train, bus, freeway, and whether the densities of people in those types of travel, like what kind of a difference that makes to our society?
I'd like to travel a lot less. And I only hope that virtual activity, I think we're getting there, and it's very interesting. We were just talking to folks, Rana's friends from Detroit. We were out doing an event in Los Angeles. There's a lot of former Detroiters, like there's a lot of former Newarkers everywhere. And they were saying having technologies like Facebook and cell phones and smartphones not only enable them to keep in touch with people they love from LA to Detroit, but wherever they go in the world. For me, you know, I fly a lot, and I have a little series coming on Atlantic cities that looks at the Aerotropolis phenomenon. And those guys were right, that airports in combination, big airports in combination with other factors really are a big stimulator of economic development. The problem there is that there aren't a lot of places that have those big airports. So I think the real challenge of our time is building the connective fiber. And I think the car is going to play a role, but it's less dependent on a car, and it's got to be rebuilding in some reasonable way. And you know, guys, this is a huge fight. Even my economist friends who have rediscovered cities, almost to a person, think reinvesting in our transit infrastructure, and particularly high-speed rail, fails their cost-benefit equations. If you ask me, they're some of the single most important things we have to do to connect ourselves back together. So I think developing a new approach to transit and connectivity is critical, and making sure places that aren't connected to major airports or to each other have that ability. And you see it, not just, you know, it's interesting. It's not just the Camdens and the Newarks and the Clevelands, but, you know, where I live in Canada, when you look at those northern territories and you look at the level of disadvantagedness and the incredible, Wisconsin, the incredible disconnection, boy, oh boy, there are other things that we have to do a just better job of connecting.
Yes, I'm Rafael Clemente. I'm the director of our Downtown Development Authority here, and I'm a local. And I'd like to start by saying how very proud we are that CNU chose to come to our city for your 20th. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Mr. Florida, you know, as we compete for investment, for residential, for consumer dollars, could you talk just a little bit about the role, about how a mid-sized city like West Palm Beach, how does it fit into the mega region that South Florida is?
Well, you know, not just because my name is Florida, but I'm a huge fan of this state. My wife and I, Rana, probably because we live up north, we live a good part of the time in South Beach. You know, it's funny, when I gave a talk with Liz was there and Frank Gehry when they opened the New World Symphony, there was this young Dutch landscape architect. And he was talking about, you know, the Gehry building and the New World Symphony in Miami, and he said, yeah, arts and culture are great, but You have warm weather, the sun, and the beach. What else do you need? And there is something stimulating in this mix of built environment, beach, and sun that is just incredible. But when I look at South Florida, I said this. I'm on record saying this. When I wrote what became the Great Reset, How the Crash Will Shape America, I said certain communities are going to have trouble rebounding, but I don't think South Florida is going to have that much trouble. Because it is the gateway to Latin America, it's a global center attracting investment from around the world, but it's a huge mega region. This southern Florida mega region that stretches up to Palm Beach, West Palm Beach, goes all the way up to Orlando, Tampa, and Miami, is one of the 20 largest economic mega regions in the world. So I think the way West Palm Beach competes is by offering something fantastic. You know this. It has an urban alternative. It has a downtown. It has excitement. It has restaurants. It has old historic buildings, and it's part of the corridor. And just keep working and working and working on that. But I think, your governor, boy, he needs his head examined. Sorry, our governor. Turning back the high-speed rail funds? Like, what kind of boneheaded move was that? Sorry. I think the rail connection that you're getting, but the more that could be a high-speed rail connection, what my students say, who are much smarter than me, they said, what a fast rail connection does, and this is very important for our Midwest, from Milwaukee to Chicago to
Maybe
Toronto.
they'll recall the governor of Wisconsin.
Yeah. My students say it enables a place to borrow size and scale. I just love this construct. So for places that are disconnected, as we can't shrink the distance, but we can, and that's, when you look at the history of urbanism, that's what we did. We not only made our cities larger, we made our cities larger by shrinking the time. We've increased the velocity of moving people, goods, and ideas. So for us in South Florida, but also many other regions that are sprawled out, we're not going to get our cars to move any faster, and they're gridlocked on the highway. We're not going to be able to scoot in planes because it takes a long time. The only way we're going to accelerate this, on the one hand, is becoming more walkable and closer to one another, and when our places are farther apart, by creating faster transit through faster rail and other high-speed rail. Anyway, I've talked too long enough and just want to say thank you guys again.
All right.
And thank you, John.
Thank you very much.